All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Shelly, welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, good to have you on. I think I had you on a year ago, the last time. I know the time before that was like 2 years ago. So I'm trying to like keep track of
I
the
think
timeline.
originally it was 2020 that we spoke.
Okay.
It was like November or something of 2020. And then, yes, I believe last year was the last time we were on. Because I was on with John. Yeah.
Third time's the charm. So,
yeah, right?
So I know for anybody who's listening, they probably have heard your story, but it was 2020. So if they haven't heard it, they can go back and kind of get a refresher. But if you're giving the elevator pitch of your life, if you're giving like the 2-minute, here's what people should know for context, what would you say?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the IFB, the Independent Fundamental Baptists. And I basically went as a missionary overseas, kind of under them. It's kind of a weird mix because my husband is Romanian. And so we were over there for a while in his home country. And so there was a clean break and a realization there that I was like raised in a really different way. I came to start calling it a cult. And then in 2020, it was the first time I was public about that story. And, you know, I had been an author, a novelist for a few years already, but there was something in the air, I guess, that made me feel like, oh my gosh, this is the story that I've been suppressing almost, you know, waiting to tell. And I think it was, honestly, Eric, when I found your podcast and I realized how young you are, I was like, oh, it's like still around. You know, I think it was kind of like out of sight, out of mind. Clearly, in the information age, this can't be happening, which is also pretty cool to watch your story of like you saw things and you started asking questions and you were able to do the research. I was not, you know, and so it just really encouraged me to come on, tell my story, and then start speaking publicly about my experiences. And it really informed the rest of my work, or my continued work, I should say, like what I'm doing currently.
Right. Yeah, it's so weird because like it's the inverse experience that I had, which was because I'm young, like, and was able to Google things. It's like I was piecing together so much of this stuff. And then I would see people who 10 years before, 20 years before, 30 years before, I mean, some like in the 60s, you know, like, and you'd go back and go, oh, this has been happening for a long time. So like I talk to people who go, oh, I saw with you, it's still happening. And then I'm like, oh, it has been happening for a really long time. And like you said, the ability to share stories was so limited just a couple of years ago. I mean, 15 years ago, 20 years ago was so limited. And then the ability to actually research these guys and put pieces together was really, really tricky.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You know, an interesting tidbit is that, so I met my husband at Hyles-Anderson, and it was 1993. And we had in the handbook that there was a banned book. So if you grew up IFB, you know that like, you signed things all the time, or you read, you know, like the rules were second nature almost, right? So I signed my name to that handbook. I skimmed it. My husband read it. He was not raised IFB, right?
Yeah.
And he went to the public library and checked out that book, and it was Fundamental Seduction.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so he read it and he was like, this place is crazy. And ultimately ended up leaving. And, you know, I married him and left as well. But, you know, that access to that small piece of information is really what led to me years, you know, many years later of understanding what I was raised in. But it didn't come to light for me because I didn't have access to it. He had a car. Girls weren't allowed to leave campus.
Right. Someone posted that recently, that it's still a written rule in the rule book that like girls are not supposed to have cars. And like if they do, there's like so many stipulations and like weird rules about it.
So messed up.
I'm curious for you, like you've had, I think you probably feel like me in terms of like, you've got a story within that world, but like you see some of the like crazy extreme stories and probably go like, well, mine wasn't as bad as theirs, but it was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Did you take any thought into, oh, let me write my story verbatim? Like, let me just go nonfiction. Here's kind of my experience in this. Or was it always like, hey, I want to tackle this from a fictional kind of angle?
So I actually started writing a memoir in 2018. So that I knew that the story was in me and that like I needed to do something with it. And then I read the book Educated by Tara Westover. Have you read that?
No, it's been recommended like 60 times and I
Yes, I
haven't
think
read it yet.
it's heavy. So for
Hmm.
me, it was so good. Like she's an exquisite writer, and just reading it was a pleasure. But at the same time, it's very heavy, and I have some similar experiences in that. Not that I was like raised in a mountain, you know, hidden from actual culture, but her escape was singing, and so that was something that I was always involved in, and I was angry that the church or the IFB used that talent of mine for their benefit, instead of having it be my escape. So I found that it was just so emotional for me. And so when I read that book, it just made me feel like I'm not ready to tell my story. I'm so, so engrossed in the crap of it, that I want to be able to be a little bit more on the peaceful side to write that memoir. And it may still happen. I actually next month I have a chapter in an anthology. I was invited to be part of an anthology of women making a difference in business and in their communities. So you know, because I speak out and do work on advocating and activism, I was invited to write part of my story. And so I have a chapter in that book that is basically, I took a lot of it from the start of my like 4 chapters that I wrote of my memoir. So yeah, maybe it'll be a full book one day. We'll see. But I do love my fiction.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like that's kind of your escape, like versus music or all the other dance, all the other things that people mention. It seems like writing has kind of been that for you. Um, I'm curious, like I've sat down to write before. I've started a couple different, like, this could be a book, you know, and one of the things that I realized is that whether talking on the podcast or writing, like the more that you talk about your experience, the more you learn about it. And you realize like when you have to do a timeline of something or when you have to write about what you were feeling at that time, and you put yourself back in those shoes or those culottes, in your case, when you put
Yes.
yourself back in that experience, you start seeing like, oh, this was worse than I remembered, or this was different than I remembered at least, or I forgot that this even happened. It seemed so small at the time. What's maybe 1 or 2 things that before you put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, like that you just didn't recognize as being harmful or even just frustrating or odd to you at the time? There's
Oh,
probably
wow.
10,000 things, but but 2 or 3.
Right, 2 or 3. So I don't know that I think that everything could be beneficial, right? So whatever phase you're in, whatever you're gravitating toward, that may just be the time that you need to experience it. And to write about it is always helpful. It might not always be a book, though. And I think that starting a book proposal is a great idea. I actually work with clients, and that's what I tell them. Whether you're going to hybrid publish, self-publish, seek a traditional publisher, start by doing the research of how to do a good book proposal, because then you'll know if you have like the content for that. And you'll also start to work through all of those feelings, especially if it's nonfiction, you know, if it's this like specifically memoir, you know, that we're speaking of telling your own story, right? You have to be able to work through that to get it in a position to where it's going to be readable to people. Because like I said, reading Tara Westover's novel showed me that I was in a position of the muck still, and that my writing wasn't ready for the public. And so that can really happen. And that's another thing. Read, write, repeat. Like just do it. Just read and write and read and write and read and write. You don't have to read full books. If you don't like a book, leave it alone, abandon it. But like,
Thank you.
yeah. You're welcome. Right?
I hate that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say I hate that. My mom always will like power through books and she'll be like, it's horrible. She'll be in like chapter 4 and I'm like, it's not an assignment. Like you can put this book down, you can burn this book. It's fine. You can do whatever you want to do. But she's like always like I'm pushing through. Even back when I was a kid, it was be like this Russian novel. It's like 1,000 pages. And I'm like,
Oh gosh.
you do not have to do this to
No.
yourself. And so I love that idea, especially with like self-help type books.
Yeah.
Like there's tons of times I'll read like the 3 chapters that look tailor-made for me and I'll leave the rest. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, of course. Like
Give
I
that
just
permission often.
yes, please. Just like use what works for you. And I think that with that mentality, it was easier for me to kind of let go of some of the things. Like I've grown to appreciate the fact that being raised in such a strict environment, have never struggled with addiction.
Hmm.
I wasn't exposed to it. Maybe it was because, I was scared to go and get in trouble even after I was like, I don't think that's true. But like there are things that I'm like, oh, that probably protected me and my personality type. So that's a good thing that I can see out of it. And I just feel that way about life. Like take the good from it and leave what doesn't work for you. Like, and I do usually commit to about the first 50 pages in a book to see, because sometimes it gets better. But yeah, I leave it when I just, I'm like, oh, this is not for me.
Right. Exactly. Well, I'm curious, like drilling down a little bit into your experience and like digging into it in the book format. Like you mentioned some things can be positive or something like, was there anything that surprised you where like maybe you thought it was something that affected you negatively worse than it did, or something that like seemed like, oh, this would be the thing people would think was super traumatic or hard to deal with, but it was a blip on my radar, because I feel like I asked that because I feel like I have a lot of things like that where I'll share something and I'll be like, oh, this happened. And people go, oh my God. And then I'll like talk about something that people just kind of brush over. And like, to me, it was super heavy. So I'm curious, was there anything that was like that, where it was like, this is what people would probably think would be a chapter, but it was kind of nothing to me?
Yeah, wow. Okay, so I will go a little bit into my backstory. And if you listen to my other interview, you'll know that I have child sexual abuse in my story. And so I say this with caution because I feel like it lands on everyone different ways.
Right.
But I have very vague memories of the experience, but very vivid memories of how the church handled it. And so the trauma, even in therapy, that I have gone through, like the deepest levels, have been not by the perpetrator of the sexual abuse, but actually about the ideologies that I internalized because of the way I was taught. And so that is very like surprising to some people. As you know, my brother and I have the same experience, the same abuser, and his is actually probably parallel, like the same damage that was, so things, manifest themselves in different ways for different people. And also I remember once telling somebody, this is like less dramatic than the, abuse, but I was telling somebody about this youth conference when I was a teenager that, the theme was mob, like the mob. And Jack Hiles was like carrying guns and everybody was like dressed as mob people. And they were like, what? Like literally. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure. So I like got on the internet to find it, to prove that I was right. Cause I was like, this is kind of unbelievable. Now that you step back and you think about it, like they were literally telling us that they
Right.
he was like the boss, the mob boss, and controlling everything. And so yes, experiences like that of just the way that we were portrayed, to me seemed normal. And flippantly, I'll talk about it, and people will be like, could you say that again? Because that
Right.
wasn't cute.
Right. Yeah. No, and the first thing you said really checks out with so many people I've talked to, where like the abuse is obviously traumatic and that's enough, that's enough trauma. But then it's the trauma of the legal process. It's the trauma of the religious reaction. It's the trauma of how the first people you talk to deal with it. And so there's layers and layers and layers on top of it. And even recently I've talked to people who, like, just the trauma of never getting closure, like the trauma
Mm,
of, the statute of limitations, or of the abuser passed away before something could happen, or all these different, one person I was talking to recently was sharing, and I'd never even thought about this happening, but it's probably happened to more than I can think of. But she was saying she remembers being abused as a little kid, but doesn't even know who it was.
mm.
And like the stuff tied into that. I mean, there's
Yeah,
that feeling of not knowing or not being able to do anything about it. And really what her take was, which I think is really cool tying to this conversation, was that you kind of live vicariously seeing other people's stories and knowing that you're not alone, and seeing that some people are seeing justice. And obviously it doesn't replace yours, but they were saying like how cathartic it was seeing other people actually put their abusers behind bars, or find
absolutely.
healing. So,
Yeah, that's definitely my experience too. And
right.
when when I watched the Let Us Pray documentary
Mhm.
that you and those incredible women did, I was so, I don't know, I had that same sentiment, right? Of like, yes,
Mhm.
justice for them is justice for all. Like, really, truly, that's how it felt. Because there are so many of us, like, that's my experience as well. I did not remember who the abuser was until my brother actually shared
Yeah.
who it was. And, like, then I did some research and everything. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
But like, I was so young, I didn't remember, the
Yeah.
actual person. And so to see those women come forward with some sort of justice. And we all wish it was more, right? But
Right.
like it really felt like, yes, that is for us all. Thank you.
Right, right. Yeah, and I'm sure people will feel that way, like listening to your story, reading through your book, like all these things that are being done. I mean, you're doing live talks, sharing your story and things like that. Like in this book specifically that you have coming out at the end of April, um, give us a little bit of context without spoiling the book. Like,
Yeah.
what can people expect to see represented in the book? Like, is it going to be a lot of elements that are kind of your story, but not really? Is it going to be a kind of collection of other experiences you've heard about or that you've seen happen within fundamentalist circles? What's kind of the 10,000-foot view of the book?
Yeah. So the book is called The Cheating Wife. It is not a personal narrative. So I'd like to say that.
Good to clear up when you give the title, to go, this is not about me. This is not a self-report.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Though, so I, came to my husband actually, and I was like, here's the idea that I have, and this is what I want to do. And he was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. But maybe put by Shelly Snowportia
Right.
on this one instead of just like the title and then your name at the
Yeah,
bottom.
a colon is not a good
Yes.
one for that. Yeah.
Right, right. So The Cheating Wife is based on an experience that my husband and I actually witnessed. We saw the defacing of somebody's property with the words cheating wife on it.
Hmm.
And it, of course, sparked a lot of conversation in our home, in our friend group. And I just was like, is she safe? Is anyone checking on
Hmm.
her? Is this the, 2023 version of the Scarlet Letter?
Yeah.
And so from that, I created a story about a woman who has been suffering abuse. And she, like, the church plays a role in it because, I live in the Bible Belt, I live in the
Mhm.
Midwest. And so, like, this idea that we treat women poorly if we even assume that they are cheaters, and yet men almost every time get a pass still is something I want to challenge. I want to say, like, hey, be better, do better.
Mhm.
This, we have an opportunity to grow and not be like we're in the 1800s, because literally that's how it felt. Like, she's in our community and now she's brandished with this, in our case, blue letters that,
It's true.
yeah. So, and I do draw a lot from the experience that I had working in a church, and, just being, friends with certain people who had experiences of being in abusive relationships. And though I have a lot of heavy themes in it, I think that it's an uplifting book. Yeah, I'm a Jane Austen fan, so if that tells you anything, like everyone has a happy ending.
Right. Right. Do you find writing in that way and giving the happy ending, do you have a optimistic look at reality, or do you just have an optimistic hopefulness when writing fictionally? Because I've become far more pessimistic I feel like over the last year. And I'm curious if your writing is a reflection of how you feel about reality, or if it's a I wish it was like this kind of approach.
Yeah, so I can't say that justice is actually served, but in my, writing, but I think an emergence of triumphant women is what I have experienced in my life. So it's
Hmm.
really what I wanted to write about. It might look different for different people. You might categorize it as different than I would in my book, but that's how I see it, that I have been proven, or it's been proven to me time and time again, that the women who have been abused and have suffered the most, that I know personally, are the most resilient and have come out on top. And I want people to see that. I want women to find themselves in this story if they've ever been abused or hurt or unseen even. I'd like people who are in the church to recognize that sometimes good people do bad things and that they can do better. I hope that they see I have a woman in the book, a character who is, still very involved in her church community, and she sees it and does something about it. So I want that to be a message. Yeah, I don't know who's going to pick up the book or the story, but I really feel like the message, especially nowadays, I'm not looking to change the world. I feel like really triggered by that,
Yeah.
But I am, I think it's important for us to share the nuance of story. And so whoever does pick up the book, I hope they can see the truth in the fiction. I forget who it was who said, it was an old classic fiction writer, but whoever it was, they said, we write fiction to tell the truth we are unable to utter. So I think that's
Googling who wrote it.
Yes. Yeah. I may have botched it a little, so something to that effect. But yeah.
Joshua Halberstam? Wendell
Sure.
Berry?
I don't know. Don't put it on like
It's
Instagram
one of those quotes
as
that,
a meme.
yeah,
It's
one
like
of those quotes that
attributed.
everybody says. Yeah, Neil Gaiman. Fiction's the lie that tells the truth.
There you go.
Wow.
There you go.
Pick one. Pick a name.
Pick one.
Shelly
That's the
Snow
thing.
Cordia said it
Yeah.
on the
Don't do
Preacher Boys
that.
podcast. Yeah, no, I love that perspective shift too, because like I said, I'm a pretty optimistic person in general, and I would say I'm as pessimistic as I've gotten. I'm still more optimistic than most people, but it is, I think the way you just described it, in terms of when you think in the macro of saving the world, it's easy to just want to crawl into a hole and die. At least that's my experience.
Yeah. Same.
When you think about the individual victories, or or even in terms of not necessarily victory in a legal setting, or victory in a case, or victory in a fill in the blank, but you're looking at just the development of a person, or the rising of a person from, captivity essentially to kind of liberation. Like there's a lot of really cool, beautiful stories. And so I like that perspective shift, because I think for me, especially lately, you're seeing not only people get screwed by the church religious system, but then it's their family, and then it's the legal system where it's 4 years to get, they spend more time in court than their abuser spends in jail or even on probation. And it's like, I think when you start looking at those bigger pictures, it's easy to just sit there and go, well, everything sucks, and like this is not going to get better anytime soon. But I
Yeah.
do think what you mentioned is like, when I think of the hope for the people sitting in the pew who are tentative about staying, when you think about the people who are, starting to really explore for themselves for the first time, like that's a really cool world that is developing a lot of really cool stories, and it's
Yeah.
easy to lose sight of it. And so I appreciate you sharing that perspective shift,
Yeah.
because I think it's needed. And I think for those of us trying to battle cynicism, it's a good thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm the same way. I watched a documentary yesterday and I'm like, well, you know what? The world is screwed.
Yeah,
Everything
right.
is like not what it seems. So there are those realities, but at the same time, the most resilient women I know have come from abuse, come
Yeah,
from, the IFB, and have emerged with college degrees, which is a major accomplishment.
yeah.
They have careers of their own, and they have even been able to buy, a house and support their children. And so, like, that to me is victorious.
Hmm.
And I think we can celebrate it.
Right.
Right. And what is justice? I don't know what that looks like, to be honest, right? What would
Hmm.
repair, and I can't answer that. I don't even know what it would looks like in my own life, much less in someone else's. And so to focus on the victories is really important for me.
Yeah, yeah. It is a question always of like, what is enough? And it, I don't think there's anything that can grant you enough. Like it's something that is affecting you for life. Like it is something that does severe damage. So like, will any ruling or any exposure make it better? I don't think necessarily, but I think those internal developments are huge. And it is, I mean, abuse or anything that violates you from the outside is a difficult thing, because you know you can't really try to think of how to word it, but like for an individual thing, like say you make a bad financial decision and you bounce back from it, like that's something you caused that you get to fix. Or if you want to further education, like that's something that maybe you didn't really pursue it or take it seriously. Now you can change it. But it's like when there's something that's stolen from you, or when you're abused, or when somebody does something to you, like they're not going to be proactive in helping you recover from that. Like two people, like, or one person really put this on you. And then you, in this rare situation, have it on yourself to rebuild from it. And that's a really interesting perspective to be approaching life from. I'm curious, like, you're focused so much on the positive things and like the things that can be controlled. Like, where do you find the balance, both in your life and in your writing, of not minimizing your own experiences while also reclaiming your life, so you're not living in a reactionary state to, oh, this happened to me, so now I am Shelly Snow Pordia, the victim, or Shelly Snow Pordia, like I am defined by this bad thing, and instead can go, that happened and now this, like, where do you find that balance without downplaying and also having a life that is your own?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, I have actually spent a lot of time thinking about that because I embrace the word victim as something that helps me identify what happened to me. I also embrace, other aspects of my own identity. And
Right.
so I look at an identity not as a label, but as a mosaic.
Hmm.
And I piece those things together for the picture of my own life. And heard in, well, what do you call it? A metaphor once about a box of Legos, right? That's what our life is like. It's basically, we are essentially these pieces and we can configure them in any way we imagine. And we don't always stay that way. We, break them down and rebuild. And I think that really just helped me kind of visualize this mosaic of my own. And I don't have to shy away from feeling like a victim at the times that I am maybe rehashing that story because I was victimized. And so what else? I think actually in my book, I have this conversation with
Hmm.
the protagonist where she's saying, why can't I say victim? Because somebody victimized me. Like, stop
Right.
telling me not to act the victim because I was hurt.
Yeah.
And, in the moment, that's how she felt. That's how I have felt.
Mm.
And so I can use that term and be like, yeah, I was a victim. And also I am triumphant. I have overcome. I am, what's the survivor? You know, that's another one that's kind of labeled as, you know, be somebody who thrives, not someone who survived. I'm like, well, no,
Right.
I can actually do both.
Yeah.
We build this picture of our lives. And once we start piecemealing it out of like, I am labeled as this, I have to be X, Y, or Z, that to me seems a little too culty.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. You're not defined by just one experience. Like there's multiple pieces. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like life is like a box of Legos that someone poured on the
Right?
floor and you're just stepping on them constantly. That's been my experience. No, I love that mosaic example because I this is something, and it's so funny talking to you because I feel like there's so many things you're saying that have been just on my mind lately, and one of those is just like I hadn't thought of it in terms of a mosaic example, but like there are many things that are true and there's many experiences, and like I think that was kind of with my last question I really wanted to hit on, is that I think some people feel forced to be one thing or feel forced to be expressing one type of process for living, you know, like for people who leave religion, it's like, well, now you can't be spiritual in any regard. Or when people
Right.
leave a relationship, it's like, well, now you can never be in close proximity to anybody, or what, like there's so many things that get just, that's the label now, and that's now your identity, versus like there's many different things that make up you as a person, and you are a collection of your experiences in many ways. But I also love the thought that you don't have to end any of these chapters. Like you can spend time re-examining and going through things that have happened and exploring how that affected you, because the older you get and the more experiences you have, the more context you have for those experiences. And so uh, I've found for me, the podcast has been the, and I can't think of a better word than box. And I've said this a couple times, and I always go back to box, which is such a negative connotation when talking about this stuff. But to me, it's like, it's the box that I like, I'm going to go open this box and talk about religious trauma. And then when I'm done, I close that box and go do all the, like, I open all the other boxes of, you know, things that I am.
Right.
And for you, do you feel like writing has been the box in which you deal with this? And then do you feel like there's a hum of religious trauma that's always there? Or do you feel like it's something now at this point in your journey, you go, I deal with it in the way I want to, I control it in this area, and then I put that box away and I have my life. I'm Shelly and everywhere else. Like, how do you feel like it plays a part in your existence now?
Yeah. I mean, you ask the easiest questions, Eric. Why don't you just throw me a
Is
curveball?
that sarcasm or is that?
Oh
I
my
always
gosh.
laugh when I'm like, I have one last question that I'm like, tell me about
Oh my
this thing that's like 20 years of therapy. Yeah, let's do
Right,
that.
exactly. Yes, that's how I feel. Okay, so you used a word that really resonates with me, and you asked if there was a hum.
Hmm.
And so yeah, so I have a background as a singer, and I rejoined an a cappella chorus last year
Hey,
for the first
Fundy
time.
approved. Way to go.
Right? Except
Acapella.
so not. The first night we sang Freddie Mercury, and I was like, I could do this. So
You're going more pitch perfect than Hyles Anderson.
it
Right.
literally is pitch perfect, trust me. Okay, so um when I went into that situation, I realized the religious trauma was with me. So there, I feel like it is always there, and it just depends on when that, you know, hum is going to, you know, come into the forefront and, you know, trigger you. Um, because we are such nuanced creatures, and dealing with it, yes, I have a writing practice, and so I do not write about religious trauma all the time.
Right.
I write for fun. I write just to keep up my habits, and I read a lot. I can't always read religious trauma, right? So I try to have
Yeah.
that balance there. I feel like for me, I'm very intentional with the conversation. So when I, started to reach out and say, hey, I've got this new book coming. I'm speaking about these certain topics. And, I just schedule that into my life to where it's not overwhelming for me. Because when I'm too deep into it, then I just get burnt out. I mean, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, right?
Yeah.
But even if I try to box it up pretty, like I said, so, things will come up, and I had to leave the Risers like recently when I've been in this chorus for over a year and we sing mostly secular songs. And there was a trigger moment for me. And I was like, oh, this is bringing up a lot of stuff I have to leave. And thankfully, I am open about my story. And so like, I had already had the discussion with my choral director that like, hey, this is my background. If I'm triggered, it's definitely not you. It's a me thing. We can talk through some of those triggers and how to best mitigate, like, having me come in as a newbie and not be completely overwhelmed that I'm not in your cult,
Yeah, right.
So, but I do find it often that is a steady hum in my life, and I don't know that it will be different. Maybe it will someday.
Yeah. It's just been on my mind a lot. Like, and that's where, that's why I like doing the show, because I get to ask questions that are for me, like it's something I know for a long time. I would wake up a lot of days, even recent. I mean, as like 2020, like I would wake up and just feel like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. Or, oh, I can't believe that experience took place. And like, it's been very recently, like the last year, and I'm bad with time. So probably the last year and a half, like I've really felt like I have, like it's, that hum's been largely gone the more that I've had a process to deal with it. And I think that's kind of where you mitigate a lot of triggers. And I even use triggers lightly when I talk about things, because like there's a huge difference between uncomfortable and like, oh, I can't even be in this room right now. But for me, it's dealing with it on my own terms has meant everything, like being able to say, here's my process and my method, much like writing for you, being able to say, okay, for the time I'm sitting down on this microphone, like this is my time to deal with this.
Yes.
And it gets rid of the, again, that reactionary life of like, oh, this thing just surprised me. And I feel like the more you can get rid of the surprises, like the more easy, for lack of a better word, because life's not easy, but the easier it gets to deal with life and to get through it every day without going, okay, there's constantly just these jack in the boxes that are about to spring open every 2 seconds, which is horrifying. But also, I mean, the surprises still happen as healed as you get. I mean, I mentioned a while back on my newsletter, but like I was at a retreat with other people and super relaxed, probably the most at peace with life I'd been like in a long time. And then I was leaving the retreat. I'm in the airport and I see a pastor who was at all the conferences that we went to growing up. And I instantly, like, palms are sweaty. Like I feel like truly triggered. Like, and I never use that word for myself ever. Like I truly felt like, oh my God, like my heart's racing. I don't even want to be in this airport. And it was a good reminder that like, as much as you have healed, it's still there. And it was just a reconfirmation of like, okay, dealing with it on my own terms has been a very healthy practice. Because here's what happens when you're in the wild. Like, here's the thing that happens when you're surprised. And so it was just a reminder, like, you're healed, but also there's some old wounds that are going to be there. And you have to learn ways to process it. And the more you heal, the less time there is between I feel like the trigger and like the back to normal, like that reset period gets shorter at least, which, I mean, that's speaking to where I'm at now. So maybe in 2 years I'll have a different response. But
well, do you think that, kind of reframing it into what is happening in the moment, like has been what has allowed you to do it? Like, well, first of all, what did you do? Did you do anything? Did you say hello? Did they see you? I want to know, like in the airport.
I ate a burrito from Starbucks and I shakily poured sriracha onto it and just ate my emotions. There you go. You're asking me questions now. No, for me, it was really, um, I feel like what's been helpful for me has been telling the truth about the situation. Like, and it does not look beautiful. Like that sounds very like, it's like, here we go. For me in that moment, it was literally just, yes, shakily pouring sriracha on a breakfast burrito. Cause I'm going to eat those every time. But for me, it was just literally telling myself internally, like, he has absolutely no control over anything in your life today. Like, he doesn't even recognize you, first of all. Like, you were a person in a group of 2,000 people that was watching him scream on stage. And beyond that, like, even if he does, or even if he saw you, or even if he hates you, and even if he's seen the Preacher Boys podcast, like, and was mad about it an hour before he was in the airport, and he does definitely know who I am, like, what's he gonna do about it? Like, tweet about it? Like, it was such a, like, oh, it's not like he's gonna call my pastor, like, there was nothing there that was like tethered to the reality I'm living now.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the whole when the body keeps the score thing, right? It's like,
Yes.
you can see someone in the same red jacket that the person who assaulted you wore, and your body, to protect you, is going to say, there's that red jacket.
Yeah.
But the way to overcome that is to tell yourself that's a different person who happens to be wearing the same jacket. And I think just telling yourself the truth about here's where I am now makes all the difference. Or, extrapolating that for someone who's listening, like, when something feels heavy and you think, oh, my parents feel this way about me. It's like, do your parents have the same control? Like, does your pastor have the same, like, does that person on the internet who you don't know, who just happens to be in the same religious group, have the same control?
Yeah.
And the answer is either yes, and like, how do I reclaim that control? Or more often, no. And I just need to remind myself that I've got the control now. And like, that's the opposite of the reactionary kind of living that really grinds my gears. Like, when I see people living in a reactionary way, because it's not the best way to live. Like, if every action you do is just an opposite reaction to what's expected of you from this religious group, like, that's not living either. It's like, what do I want for my life and how do I pursue that?
How do you think you got to that place? So for me, I remember that the biggest, like, devastation, it was probably like that, last little click of that latch that just untethered me from everything.
Another good metaphor. Bring a writer on and like see how many metaphors you get to use later.
Right. But I realized I could trust myself. And that felt like a huge, huge, huge betrayal, because I was like, oh, I can trust myself in the moment to, like, do the simplest things like you're talking about, Eric, like saying, oh, that's a different person. I'm not in that situation. That person isn't in control. So that takes a level of trust in myself that I did not have for decades. And that was huge for me. So I was just wondering, like, for you, what was that allowed you to say, oh, I can trust that I know better in this circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to throw another metaphor onto
Please do,
but why
and
not?
we'll
Let's
fun.
stack them up. At least one of these someone will be like, oh, that makes sense. But I think as you were saying that and saying trusting yourself, like, I mean, going back to writing, I mean, you're taught from an early age that you're an unreliable narrator,
Yeah.
like, you're taught that, especially as a woman in the IFB, like, you're taught, like, you're a deceiver, like, you're a descendant of Eve, like, you are the most unreliable of narrators, but even for me, like, I believe that I was unreliable in terms of I needed to verify what I was feeling with the leadership that I did trust, because I trusted the leadership more than myself. And that's a common experience of whether you're in Nexium or Scientology or the IFB or Mormonism or fill in the blank. That seems to be a common experience of I ran all of my thoughts through somebody. And I don't think there's like here's the really sexy system I use now to like overcome that. I think it's just a passage of time. And again, constantly having conversations with yourself again to confirm what's true. And that's not to go down a big rabbit hole, but like that was kind of the big breaking point for me with the IFB is like,
Mm.
once I realized they were lying about how they dealt with abuse, to me, it was a clear line in the sand moment of like, if they're not telling the truth about this, the most important thing, how do I take their word for anything else? And it wasn't as, I mean, that sounds easy to say now, like versus 2011, where like I'm figuring all that stuff out.
Right.
But it's one of those things where over time, I'm looking at my life and going, oh, they lied about this. They lied about that. And the thing that they said would happen to me has not happened. The things
Yeah.
that they said I would become, I have not become. My friend and I talk about this all the time of like, you hear the stories of you leave the church and your marriage falls apart and this happens, you get addicted to drugs and all the like, blah, 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 all those things. And then we look at our lives and we're like, we've been married almost 10 years now and we're good parents. And, like we do drink and drinking can be great in moderation and, all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And like that slippery slope just doesn't exist in the way that we were so terrified of it existing. And again, it's like the journey for me out from 2011 when that spark was lit or the crack began or whatever metaphor you want to use there to now has just been just constant research and confirmation of they were building a house of cards. There's another metaphor. Good God.
Yeah.
But they were built on this. That wasn't based in reality. I'm living my life and seeing things that are both good and negative for me that I'm seeing through experience. Like, but ultimately it's like, what is truth? And I think the minute you start taking truth for granted and you're not investigating it, both in what you're telling yourself and what others are telling you, I think the more you can get through that process, like the better place you're going to be, because we tell ourselves bullshit all the time too. Like there's plenty to examine in our own experiences, but that can be as simple as what I was saying about the airport. Like I was sitting there and that hum, that underlying thing was going, oh my God, he's way above me. Oh, he's this big, powerful leader. The guy's a nobody to anybody outside that world. And I'm not outside, like I'm not in that world anymore. So like, why am I letting that emotion control me instead of reclaiming the truth, which is I run my life and I operate my life and people like me. And I'm not this person that I'm worried they think I am. It's constantly just going, what is the truth? And giving yourself honest answers and also being okay with the fact that sometimes you are the problem in a case, or you are the person who is being crazy in this moment. Like, but what is the objective truth of the situation? What is the thing that is not rooted in just flat out lies about, who you are or who another person is, or, fill in the blank. But there's 10 minutes. Here's 10 minutes for anybody who wanted 10-minute interview of me. That was a very fulfilling section for them.
No, I think it's good. It's important to hear from you and like how it plays out too in your life, because who would have thought? Like I have always been an investigator, right? I've always wanted to know things, read things, learn things. And until I really started to collect my own evidence, I didn't see it, right? I was buying what they were selling, or, or trying to convince myself that the experience that I was living was not matching up to what they were telling me because I was wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So to take that leap and to really, or just, I guess it's not even a leap. It's kind of baby steps, isn't it? Where you just like, oh, well, that's different. And you give yourself permission to start collecting evidence and living off of your own evidence. And honestly, Eric, it's like you use that phrase of like, investigating truth. In our world, when we were growing up, there was truth and lies. There wasn't like nuance to truth. Like, can this be true and this be true and that be true? And yes, like they can all be true. But we were never, ever, ever given that experience of critical thinking to where more than one thing can be true.
Right. Yeah. Well, it wasn't even buying what they're selling. I mean, for both of our experiences, like we were kids. So like it was truth. Like the lies were truth,
Right.
you know,
Yes.
like it was the sky is blue. I say this all the time. I need to come up with new things. Um, I feel like a comedian now where it's like, I have to come up with a new joke for this because people are gonna get tired of it. But it's true. So I'm gonna keep saying it. But like this, it was the sky is blue, like grass is green, 1 + 1 is 2. And then here's all this rigorous theology, like from the time you're a little kid.
Mhm.
And so it's quite literally hardwired, you know,
Yeah.
it's that hum of that operating system that you had installed. And so like it wasn't like you sat there. I envy people who say like, "Oh, I joined a cult at 20." And I'm like, "Well, that's a lot of work to deal with, but like
Yeah.
what do you do if you grew up in this? And what do you do if you didn't ever make a choice? Like at least you picked your poison in some way.
Yeah.
Like what do you do when like your mind idles and you instantly revert back to what you were raised in? Like it's a
Yeah.
mess, but it is learning that skill of investigation and being able to go, okay, that was not the only option. I was told it was for 20 years, but
Yeah.
there's all these other things. And so I think that's a really valuable process to learn. And I think that's like if I was to write a book, and I definitely feel like that's something I want to do, you know, sometime soon.
I hope so.
Like
Mhm.
I really want to focus in on that kind of mindset of not just having the reactionary, because I always go back to the default fundamentalist conversation. Like people tend to go, I left this group, now I'm all in on this without critically thinking through it. And so I'd really love to write something that examines like why we tend to be drawn to the black and white
Yeah.
and why we are default fundamentalists and why, you know, living in direct contrast to whatever you grew up in is not freedom. Like you're still living in service of that system. And I think that the thing that we need to develop is not necessarily how we agree with the system 100%, but like what is our process for receiving information, processing it, and then applying information. And I feel like that's a skill that was never taught to us. And it's like the number one skill I think everyone needs to learn, especially those that are healing from a toxic system. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area, but it's why I like having these conversations too, because I feel like you're saying so many things that I'm like, well, I'm thinking that like
Yeah. Yeah.
there's some truth to this being some part of the process, you know.
Or my dog.
It's okay.
Uh,
Editing.
editing. Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way, and it's really fascinating that you say that, and I hope that you do write this book because education has been key for me, like
Yeah.
access to information. And I know that we live in this just crazy world of, you know, bombardment of information, and it's hard to decipher the
Yeah.
reality from, you know, what is made up. But
Or what is
it's
algorithm?
yeah, or what is algorithm,
Yeah.
right? Oh my gosh, like seriously, I can't battle
Talk about a
algorithms
fuel
anymore.
for modern fundamentalism when you've got an algorithm
Oh my gosh.
you know, confirming constantly that
Yes.
your ideology is the way and not seeing any counterpoints. But
Yeah.
I'll save
Yeah.
that for the book. But
Right. Yes, do that.
I'm
And
glad
I
I
mean,
told a writing coach that I'm thinking about writing a book because I know I'm definitely in some email funnel now. But
hey, I do not unethically add anyone to my email list. So if you didn't
hey,
sign up for it,
thank
you're not
you.
getting it.
Let
So
me say this, but just before we say anything else, if I email somebody, my biggest pet peeve in the world is when I've emailed people, one, just random people who I've emailed with to like answer a question, or they've emailed me and we've corresponded, and then I start getting their email because they just think like now we're tight, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah.
My biggest pet peeve ever is when I've pitched guests, and this has happened a few times. I've pitched guests to come on my show and they've declined coming on the show, but added me to their email list. That is like, if you do that, you're dead to me. And I've literally had people that I've pitched that have done that where like, I think now I could get them, but out of spite, I will never have them on the show because
You're
like
like,
it
no,
drives me so crazy.
no.
And it happens all the time. Like even just
That's
people
like
who I'm like,
technically like not legal, correct?
I
Because
mean,
there has to be
technically,
like a
yeah.
consent, like thing going on.
Yeah, it's definitely
I'm just
not
saying.
legal, but it drives me
It
crazy.
is
And I've had it
annoying.
with people who are like just not even in the same realm of what I do. Like it's just like, here's my personal thoughts on. I'm like, I don't care about that at all. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
That's
Um,
okay. I'm glad you did.
so don't do that.
I will
Don't do
not.
that.
I will not.
Um,
Yeah, but no, I do hope that you write the book and that you get the information out there for us, because I think everyone's perspective matters. Especially if we're looking at it through lens of learning
yeah,
and not dogma. I hope we get more and more of that
yeah,
material out there explaining why we can embrace the nuance, the mosaic, if you will, and move from there, because the polarities are literally killing us.
right.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I said it on the Leaving Eden podcast, the perspective that's really been missing from public discourse has been that of the straight white male. So I really want to throw my hat in the ring
I'm
and
so glad you.
because I think it's time that a guy that looks like me is represented in media. So
Yes, yes, I love it. Sarcasm.
let the record show she was muted, but she was laughing for
I was.
anybody listening.
My
That was
dog
not
keeps making
It
noise.
was a joke. But anyway, well, for people who are listening, The Cheating Wife, which is not based on you, uh, just to clarify.
Yeah.
Even when I title the episode, I'll have to keep that in mind. The Cheating
Yeah.
Wife, it's the SEO on that is not great. But it comes out April 24th.
Yes.
For people who are wanting to check it out, last chance elevator pitch, why they should buy it and who should buy it and where can they buy it.
Well, people who love fiction should buy it. And
It's broad.
yes, it is broad. It is broad. So I'll bring it down. I'll narrow it down. But it's really, the target audience is for women, and hopefully women who have had any experience within a relationship where they have felt belittled or manipulated or controlled. I do, like I said, have the church plays a bit of a role in it. So if you're familiar with the Bible Belt or any type of coercive control within that environment, I think it'll resonate with you, and ultimately see how we can do better as a society to move past labeling people for their mistakes, or even to quick judgments. So yeah.
No. All right. Well, if you're listening to this, be sure to check the link in the show notes of this episode. Depending on when you're listening, you either have the option to join the launch team for the book, or if you're going back and listening to this a couple months down the road, there is a link to order the book directly in the show notes of this episode. I highly recommend anything Shelly does. I think it's your third time on the podcast, so I think that's a good indicator I co-sign you as a person. So I hope people will check it out. And thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure as always.